So this is the chapter on appraising. And we're going to have to define some terms first. What is value, what is price, and what is cost? Value is the worth of an item at a certain time. And I always tell that same story that when my boat had some issues and I found myself in the middle of Shark River, I was glad I had a life jacket on. The life jacket had a value of $7 when it was in Walmart. And when I fell out of the boat, it was worth $1 million. So again, the value of an item is the worth of an item at a certain time. The market value, which is what we are looking for when we do an appraisal, is the most probable price a ready, willing, and able buyer, not forced to buy, will pay a ready, willing, and able seller, not forced to sell, with a reasonable amount of marketing time. That's the definition of market value. And you want to memorize that, because when you are working with a seller and they're looking to put their house on the market using you as the listing agent, and they're being unreasonable in the price, you might want to tell them that here's the definition of market value. And if you're going to price your house so high that it takes an extraordinary amount to sell, it's probably not going to sell for market value and could end up hurting you in the long run. The next term that we want to define is market price. Market price is what a person pays for a property. And the last term is cost. Cost is the cost of the improvements, which is the cost of the building, to construct the building, plus the value of the land. Sometimes all four of these line up. Sometimes they're all different. But when we do an appraisal, we are looking for the market value, the most probable price a ready, willing, and able buyer who is not forced to buy will pay a ready, willing, and able seller, not forced to sell, in a reasonable amount of marketing time. The next thing we're going to look at is the economic characteristics of value. And these economic characteristics of value apply to everything. And if you take economics, you're going to learn this your first day in class. So the economic characteristics of value are demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. Now these spell out a word. They spell out the word dust. And since we have a multiple choice question, you can count on the fact that you will probably see this in a multiple choice question. So the economic characteristics of value are demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. What are they? Demand is the need or desire to have a good or a service, but it's also got a secondary component. And that secondary component is the availability of capital to satisfy that desire or need. So why do you think the federal government is passing out money like crazy right now? Because they want to keep demand strong for consumer goods and demand strong for real estate by handing out plenty of capital, so that there is plenty of capital out there to satisfy that need or desire. That keeps demand strong and keeps prices from falling. Utility is how useful something is, the power to render a service or fill a need. And if something has no use, it has no value. If something has no use, it will have no value. The next one is scarcity. Scarcity is in relationship to supply and demand. The greater the supply, the less pricing will go up. The lower the supply, the more prices will go up. And right now we have a very, very low inventory, very few houses on the market. Our supply is way down, therefore prices are going up. So scarcity is considered in relation to supply and demand. How scarce something is may affect its value. The next one is transferability, and that is how reliable the transfer is, how reliable the rights of ownership is. For an economic definition, it also has to do with physical mobility. We know real estate has no physical mobility. But the second part of transferability is how reliable ownership is, how reliable the possession and control of the rights of ownership are. And we achieve a high level of transferability in New Jersey because we get marketable title through the issuance of title insurance. So our transferability is assured by title insurance. Okay? So dust, demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. All these have to do with the value of everything. And they also have to do with the value of real estate. Now, these are the concepts that have principles of value as they are specifically related to real estate. The first one is the principle of supply and demand. When there's not many houses on the market and the supply is low, prices go up. When there's a lot of houses on the market and there's a great supply, prices go down. When there is a large amount of capital available, prices go up. When there is no capital available, there's no money to borrow, prices go down. That's the principle of supply and demand. The next one is the principle of change. All real estate goes through a cycle of change. And on the test, they may not use these exact words, but the principle is growth, stability, decline, renewal. So when you first start with real estate, it goes up in value in the very beginning in the growth stage. At some point it levels off. That's when it's in the stability stage. Now it gets real old and it gets near the end of its useful life, and now it's in decline. And then finally, when the value of the house in the lot, the real estate, is worth only the value of the lot, in other words, the house has no value, you have reached the time for you to renovate it or start all over again. So growth, stability, decline, and renewal. That's the principle of change. The next one is the principle of substitution. The principle of substitution states that something is only worth what something can be easily substituted in its place for. So if you go to the store and you buy a bottle of water at Wawa, that bottle of water is only worth what the one behind it can easily be substituted in its place for. And we use the principle of substitution when we're doing a comparable market analysis using comparable sales. We're saying your house is only worth what another one can be easily substituted in its place for. The next principle is the principle of highest and best use.
Hey, Bruce, I'm sorry. Before you go to that one, can you tell us which phase we are in right now for the principle of change? Are we in a decline phase or stability phase at the current pandemic reason?
So the principle of change does not necessarily apply to that. The principle of change applies to the life cycle of a house, not the economic conditions. So the life cycle.
Oh, okay.
So for instance, if you were to build a house now, at a current, a stick-built house now, the life cycle of that house might be only 70 years. So we're talking about where it is in the life cycle. You might build like that Walmart we talked about the other night, where they're building it with very inexpensive materials so they can take it down very easy. The life cycle of that building is only 50 years. So in the principle of change, growth, stability, decline, renewal, that cycle will be accomplished in just the 50 years. Because at the end of the 50 years, they're going to take the building down because it's no longer worth anything in terms of the land. So again, it's a good question, but it doesn't apply to where we are in terms of current market conditions. The next one is the principle of highest and best use. The principle of highest and best use says you will find your highest value when you have found the highest and best use. And if you have the highest and best use, you'll have the highest value. So I always use the exact same example for this. My office building in Highland Park is a house that was built in 1890. As a single family house, it's only worth $289,000. But I use it as an office. And as an office, it's worth $389,000. The building is exactly the same, but I have found a better use. I have found a higher use. So the principle of highest and best use says that when you have found the best use, you will have the highest value. That's the principle of highest and best use. The next one is the principle of increasing and decreasing returns. The principle of increasing and decreasing returns says that sometimes you will be able to do something to your property, spend some money on it, that will increase the amount of rent let's say, that you get on the property. So you might, in New Brunswick, if you have a property that's over by students, you might add an extra bedroom by converting the dining room to a bedroom. And that might cost you $1,000, but an extra bedroom will bring you $6,000 a year in income. So the principle of increasing and decreasing returns might mean that in that case, it's worth it to fix the dining room into a bedroom. But you also might have where you're going to put a granite countertop in the kitchen. And if you're renting to students and you put a granite countertop in the kitchen, that costs you $3,000, it may not increase your rent. And so now you're hitting decreasing returns. You spent $3,000 on something that is not necessarily going to increase your income. The next concept is the principle of contribution. And this is sort of similar to increasing and decreasing returns. The principle of contribution says that sometimes you will make an improvement to your house. And the definition of improvement means you're going to add some physicality to your house. You're going to add a garage, or you're going to add a dormer, or you're going to add a wing to your house. Or you're going to put an in-ground swimming pool in your backyard, because an in-ground swimming pool is real property. So the principle of contribution states that you might put an in-ground swimming pool in your backyard, and it might cost you $25,000 to put that pool in. But the information we get from all the sales of people with pools in their backyard will tell us that you'll only receive about half of that, about $12,500 in extra value in your house. So you wouldn't put a pool in your backyard if you're trying to flip a house, but you would put a pool in your backyard if you want to make your kids happy. Again, because putting a pool in the backyard, it costs you $25,000, but it only adds $12,500 to the value of your house. That's the principle of contribution. Many times I will have someone who has a Cape Cod or a ranch ask me, should I sell this house and buy a bigger one, or should I put a second floor on this house? And the answer is, depends. The answer is we'll have to do a market analysis and see what your house will be worth after you put the second floor on and see how much it's going to cost you. And then we'll look at what it would cost you to buy another house. And almost always it's better to buy another house than it is to put a second floor on your house, because there is nothing that adds 100% of what it costs to the value of your house, except for painting and except for landscaping. The next one is the principle of competition. The principle of competition says that excess profits bring about excess competition. And excess competition ruins the profits. So last year and the year before, there was tremendous profits in flipping houses. The market wasn't quite so hot, and you could buy a house that was in bad condition for a big discount, and then you could fix it up and flip it, and you could make a lot of money. And then all the TV shows came on, Flip This House, all the fix and repair and flip shows were on, and there's like 9 of them on now, I think. And what that did is it brought plenty of competition. Everybody thought they could be a flipper. And when there was so many new people flipping property, what happened was nobody made as much profit, because now it cost you so much more to buy the before product, the before house, because everybody was bidding on it, and that ruined the profits. So the principle of competition says that excess profits bring about excess competition, and excess competition ruins the profits. The next one is the principle of conformity, and this is one of my favorites. We are all very much more comfortable when everything is familiar and the same. So the principle of conformity says that when all things are the same, they have a higher value. When all things are the same, they have a higher value. And that's because familiar feels better. There's 2 subsets to the principle of conformity: progression and regression. Progression is when you have the crummiest house in the nicest neighborhood. If you have the crummiest house in the nicest neighborhood, the nice houses pull your value up more than it really should be. And regression is when you have the nicest house in the crummiest neighborhood. Regression is when the crummy houses pull your value down. So these flip shows all are buying houses that are the smallest house in really, really expensive neighborhoods. They never buy the biggest house in a beat up neighborhood because it doesn't make sense. That's the principle of conformity. And builders know this because when builders build a 500 house subdivision, they build all the same house. They build all colonials. They don't build a colonial, a bi-level, and a ranch because they wouldn't be conforming, and therefore it would reduce the values of everyone's house. The next one is the principle of anticipation. And the principle of anticipation states that sometimes we derive extra value from the anticipation of something happening in the future. Remember, Google's headquarters was going to move to Queens, and all of a sudden all the values went up? Principle of anticipation. In North Brunswick, there's a fabled train station going to open. And all the houses around that fabled train station have gone up in value. That's the principle of anticipation. The anticipation of a future event may increase values. The next one is the principle of plottage. The principle of plottage says if you buy one house on a 50 by 100 lot, just for example, and then you buy the house next door on a 50 by 100 lot, just for example, and then you buy the house next door on a 50 by 100 lot, just for example, now you have 150 by 100. And it might be worth it to tear them all down and build something that has a much higher use. So the principle of plottage is when you're putting smaller pieces together. It's also known as the principle of assemblage. You're assembling smaller pieces into one larger piece. Other considerations when we look at value is social considerations. How good are the schools? So if you know Edison at all, you know that 08820 goes to J.P. Stevens High School, one of the top 50 high schools in the country. And 08817 goes to Edison High School, not even one of the top 50 high schools in New Jersey. So the houses in North Edison are worth about 50% more than the exact same house in South Edison because of those social considerations. We also have physical considerations, how the streets are laid out. There's a really good example of this in Sayreville. On the quadrant that's bordered by Main Street and Washington Avenue, there is a neighborhood called Tangletown. And the reason it's called Tangletown, it's like Quaid Street and Albert Street. The reason it's called Tangletown is the streets aren't perpendicular and parallel. The streets are laid out like somebody took spaghetti out of a pot and threw it up against the wall. So your front door will face somebody else's side door, and their side door will face somebody else's back door. Those kind of physical considerations reduce the value of the property. Also, how close you might be to flooding. Physical considerations might reduce the value of the property. The next thing that we consider is economic considerations. Economic considerations are how many jobs there are and what they pay. So economic considerations in Edison, on Route 1, there was a Ford plant. And that Ford plant made Ford Ranger pickups. And you could work in that Ford plant with not even having a high school diploma and make $100,000 a year with overtime. When they closed that Ford plant, they put up a BJ's wholesaler there. People who work in there make $10, $12, $13 an hour. So the value of the properties around that neighborhood went down because the overall amount people are earning there went down. So economic considerations also have to do with recessions. And your question about what's going on now with COVIDs, in some areas where COVIDs is hitting very hard and there's large job losses, especially in the service industry, we're seeing values potentially going to go down. That's economic considerations. Other things are governmental considerations. You have no idea how often people come into my office in Highland Park and say, I'm not buying a house in Highland Park or in East Brunswick because the taxes are too high. Government considerations are things like taxes. Government considerations are also how difficult it is to build. There are certain towns that builders won't build in because the building department in those towns are very, very, very strict. All right, so we're going to have all those things in our mind when we do an appraisal. And remember, we're not going to be appraisers. Appraisers have an appraisal license. They take an appraisal class and they do an apprenticeship. but we're learning how to do appraisals so that we can value people's properties, and we're learning how to do appraisals so we can pass the test. So the appraisal process has several steps. The first step is to define the problem. Why am I doing this appraisal, and as of what date? So we can do an appraisal on a property as of today, and we can do an appraisal on a property as of any day in the past if we have enough data, but we can't do it in the future. So why am I doing this appraisal, and as of what date? So for instance, if you inherited a house 15 years ago, you might need to get an appraisal done on what it was worth 15 years ago so you can calculate your capital gains. So again, step number one is to define the problem. Step number two is you're going to inspect the neighborhood and the subject property. Now I want to talk about a term here. If you're going to sound like you know what you're talking about, you always want to refer to the property that you're appraising as the subject property. You don't call it the home, you don't call it the house, you don't call it the appraisal property or the appraised property. You call the property you're appraising the subject property. So step two is to inspect the neighborhood and the subject property. Step three is to collect all the pertinent data. Comparable sales, what things rent for, how's the economy in the area, jobs going up or going down, how long are things on the market, all part of the pertinent data. Step number four, apply each approach to value. And there are three approaches to value: comparative sales method, income approach, and cost approach. And an appraiser will use each of these three approaches, and then they will make a comment on which one is the most appropriate. Step number five, and memorize that word, correlate. Step number five is correlate the value estimates. We are not averaging them. We are not taking the middle value. We're correlating. What does correlate mean? Correlate means that you're going to use subjective judgment. This is an opinion of value, not a finding of value. So you're going to use subjective judgment, and you're going to look at the three values you have, and then you're going to apply sort of a weighted process. Which one is the most closely similar to the subject property? So step five is to correlate the value estimate. Step six is to prepare the appraisal report. And at the end of the appraisal report, you're going to write a narrative as to why you believe that is the value of the property. Now, when I do broker price opinions for banks, all of this stuff is included in the process. And I have to make comments on how's the neighborhood. I have to make comments, is this an over development of the neighborhood or an underdevelopment? I have to make comments as how much unemployment there is. How long are things on the market? This is all stuff that's part of an appraisal report and goes into your opinion of value. The three approaches to value are the sales comparison approach, and that uses the principle of substitution. Something is only worth what another thing can be substituted in its place for. Number two is the income approach, and that's what is the value of a stream of income. And the third one is the cost approach. And the cost approach is what it's going to cost you to reconstruct that building plus the value of the land. All right, so those are the three methods that we're going to use. And actually, an appraiser applies all three methods to every property he appraises. When you guys do broker's price opinion, you're probably only going to use the sales comparison approach. Sometimes you might use the income approach, but as a salesperson, rarely are you going to use all three. An appraiser would use all three, but as a salesperson, rarely are you going to use all three. So the first method is the sales comparison approach. And we're using the principle of substitution. Something is only worth what something can be easily substituted in its place for. But here's the catch. Even if you had two identical homes that were built by the same builder at the same time, and 10 years later you're trying to appraise them, they're going to be slightly different in price because maybe there's different amenities in each one. Maybe one has been maintained better than the other. So again, we're going to have to make some kind of adjustments. So when you use the principle of substitution, you're going to use a similar location. You're going to use houses that sold at a similar time, and houses that had a similar utility. What I mean by that, if you're doing a house today, you're only going to look at things that closed in the last couple of months, maybe 6 months, maybe 3 months. If you're going to do use comparable sales and you're going to use actives, you're going to use things that are active now. And typically in an appraisal, you are going to use 3 closed comparable sales and 3 active houses on the market now. But they want to have similar location, similar time frame, and similar utility. And what I mean by time frame, we talked about appraising someone's house when they inherited it 10 years ago. Well, when you go back to appraise that house now, you're going to have to use things that closed 10 years ago. Okay? This is best used for homes and developments, single
Hey,
family.
Bruce,
Yes.
what is the CIA and CBS? What is the acronym CIA for?
I don't know. Where do you see that?
I see it in the book. It says on page 445, it says if the comparable has a feature that is inferior, you add C, and then you add, it says in the parentheses CIA.
We'll get to that in a minute, and it's very confusing.
Okay.
So keep an open mind.
Okay.
We'll get to that in a minute. So this is best used for homes and developments, condos and co-ops, single-family homes, maybe a 2-family home if there's a lot of 2-family homes that are the same. And we have some very special rules on this. Remember, the property that we are appraising is called the subject property. The property that we are appraising is called the subject. So rule number 1 is never touch the subject. And this is what you were just asking about. Rule number 2 is increase for inferiorities. So I for I. Increase for inferiorities, I for I. And then rule number 3 is subtract for superiorities, S for S. So we are going to have to make adjustments to the comparables in order to make them similar to the subject. But we don't touch the subject. We don't make adjustments to the subject. Instead, we I for I and S for S in the sales comparison approach. So here is an example. This is off of an appraisal. These are competitive closed sales. The property is 5 Beebe Avenue in Spotswood. Should close next week. In the first column here, I've described everything about 5 Beebe. Here's our comparable sales on the columns next to them. And we see we have 2 Crestwood, 10 June, and 86 Dora. And we have their descriptions here. And where there are differences, we have to make adjustments. And if you look at the column that says subject, there are no adjustments to the subject because rule number 1 is never touch the subject. Now we do see, excuse me, we do see some adjustments in the above grade room count. So if we come down here to the above grade room count, we're going to see that the subject has 7 total rooms. The comparable has 8. The subject has 3 bedrooms. The comparable has 4. And both have 1.5 baths. So we're finding that the comparable is superior. It's superior. And what do we do for superior? We subtract for superior. So we are going to subtract 7,500 for superior. We subtract for superior. Okay? Here we've also subtracted for superior, but the house is a little bit smaller, so we've subtracted a little bit less.
How you come up, how you know how much amount to subtract?
So there is a book that costs $750 that the appraisers have that tell them exactly how much to subtract for every kind of house in every kind of price range with factors for age. How do I do it? Because I know about what a house that has 8 rooms versus 7 rooms sells for different. As long as you're close and as long as you're consistent, then it's okay. There's also charts that you can have, and if you ever attend one of the classes on how to do appraisals, the all-day classes that there's a couple of guys who give them, they'll give you the chart that shows you what to make for adjustments for these kind of things. But in my case, It's from experience of knowing the difference. But let's just say in the event here, you had made this one here a $10,000 adjustment. You had made this 10. As long as you made this one maybe a little more than 5,000, it would be okay. If you made this 50,000, you know that an extra bedroom isn't worth 50,000. So again, the answer is there is a book. It's $750 that has all the adjustments for everywhere in the country, for every age of house, for every factor you could possibly have. Also, the guys who teach the classes on how to give values on houses will give you a chart, and you just learn how to do it over time also. All right, so what we look at here is 2 Crestwood. We can see here it's sold for $378. And then we made adjustments, minus 75, minus 93.50, minus $10,000, minus $5,000. All those things were because the comparable was superior. And we ended up with a total adjustment of $31,850. And so now our adjusted sales price is making it equal to the subject is $38,150. And we did it with all 3 of the properties. And when we did the adjustments on all 3 of the properties, we came up with $348,150, $367,150, $329,700. And now we have to correlate all those values. So we have to look at which property was the closest to our property. And actually, if we look at which was the closest, we might say, well, subject number 3, comparable number 3 was built in 1940. That's not really comparable. So we probably want to get one of these that's built a little bit earlier. So this one was built in 68. It has 8 bedrooms and 8 rooms and 4 bedrooms, but it only has 1.5 baths. It's about the same size. So if I was going to come up with a value, I'd come up with a value somewhere between 346 and 367. And it's an opinion, right? It's not a formula. It's an opinion of value. The more of these you do, the better you get at it, but it's an opinion of value. Okay, and what we would do is that would give us our opinion of value on the comparable sales method. The second method that we might use is the income approach. I always like to use the example on this, that if you go to the 7-Eleven tonight and you buy a lottery ticket that has a $1 million first prize, you don't win $1 million, even though it says $1 million on it. The state of New Jersey runs the lottery. It's a tax for people who don't know how to do math. So even if you were to win the $1 million prize, what you get is you get $50,000 a year for 20 years. So, and that's the way it works in New Jersey. If you won the $1 million prize, you get $50,000 a year for 20 years. Now you can choose if you want that or if you want the cash today. And if you choose the cash today, you're going to get about $600,000. So what that tells us is that $50,000 worth of income, if a property has $50,000 worth of income, it's going to be worth about $600,000. Okay? Now, the income approach says that we're looking for the present value of a stream of income. The present value of a stream of income. And the way we come up with that number is the net operating income divided by the cap rate. And this kind of a appraised value is best for income producing properties, apartment complexes, maybe a strip mall, maybe a factory. Net operating income divided by the cap rate gives us this number. What's the value of the stream of income? So in our income approach, we have some terms we have to define. The NOI is the income, and we're going to take the income less vacancy factors, because you normally would factor in a 3% or a 5% vacancy factor. You might put in a 0% vacancy factor if you never have any vacancies. Then you're also going to subtract any expenses you might have, and you're going to subtract any taxes you might have, but you do not subtract debt service. You do not subtract your mortgage payments. Because if you think about it, how much you owe on the house has no relationship to what its value is to me. How much you owe on the house has no relationship of what that house's value is to me. It has a relationship to your equity, but no relationship to its value. So when we do the NOI, it's income, less vacancy factors, less expenses. And expenses are things like utilities, water bills, insurance, and taxes, but they are not debt service. We also do not include reserves for capital improvements. A reserve for a capital improvement might be that every time you get a rent check, you put $100 into an account because you know you're going to have to repair the roof somewhere down the line, and now you've got $5,000 in that account. But that doesn't add to the value of your building because it's just in a separate account. So reserves for capital improvements are also not included in the NOI. NOI is the income, less vacancy factor, less expenses. And expenses could be utilities, could be taxes, could be insurance, could be property management. But it is not debt service, and it is not reserves for capital improvements. So one of the questions that comes up is, what the heck is the cap rate? And the cap rate, we can look at it as the cost of money, but we could also look at the cap rate as the return the property would give you if you paid cash for it. The return the property would give you if you paid cash for it. Now, how do cities know the cap rate? How does an appraiser know the cap rate? How does your bank know the cap rate when they're lending you money? Well, what they do is they look at all the properties that sold everywhere within your market, and they look at what their income was, and they look at what their expenses were, and then they come up with the cap rate. When you have an income producing property, you are, by law, supposed to generate an income and expense statement that you send to your economic coordinator in your municipality. And then they send that to the state, and then the state develops cap rates. But really what a cap rate is, really, it's the return that you would get if you paid cash for the property in terms of income and expenses divided by what you paid for the building. Okay, so the cap rate is the cost of your money, or it's the rate of return you would expect if you paid cash for the building. And if you say the cap rate is 8%, we write it as 0.08. 8%, the way we write that in a number, is 0.08. 7% is 0.07. And it's determined in the census, or by your economic coordinator in the municipalities, or by the market, or just by what rate of return an investor wants. Now, I Googled tonight cap rates in New Jersey. And what we're seeing here is all different cap rates. Here's a building that you could buy in Jersey City that has a 7.84% cap rate. That means if you paid full price for it and you considered all the expenses, you would make a 7.84% return if you paid cash for it, because we do not include debt service. Here's another building for $7 million. Right? If you paid $7 million for this building, you take in all your rent and take out all your expenses and then divide that money by what you paid for it, you get a 4.6% cap rate. So different kinds of buildings have different cap rates. Here's another one that has a prime development opportunity with a strong tenant cash flow at 5.59% cap rate. So all of these are just examples of the expected rate of return based on the income minus the expenses divided by the sales price. So let's look at this one for just a second. If you were going to buy this property and a 4.6 cap rate was not sufficient for you, that's not a high enough rate of return. Well, one of the things that you could do is just pay less for it. Instead of paying $7 million, maybe you're only going to pay $6 million for it. And if you only paid $6 million for it, your cap rate would probably go up to about 6% or 7%. Okay? So that's a question that sometimes comes up on the test, where they're asking you to understand that value by income is equal to the net operating income divided by the cap rate. Okay? The other night I told you guys, if you have investment properties, you are always going to raise the rents, because NOI is rent minus expenses. So what if your expenses go up, but your rent doesn't? Then this number goes down, your NOI goes down. And if your NOI goes down, it is a direct relationship between NOI and value. So if your NOI goes down, your value goes down. Okay? Very important consideration. So again, value by income is equal to NOI divided by your cap rate. NOI divided by your cap rate. So if you want a higher cap rate, if instead of 5% instead of 4.6% cap rate, you want a 6% cap rate, that means your cap rate is going to go up. Your cap rate is an inverse ratio to your value. So if you want a higher cap rate, you've got to pay less for the building. You've got to pay less than $7 million for the building. So you want to keep that equation in mind so you know what you need to do to change your values. Okay? Now we have an interesting example coming up that will really illustrate all this stuff. The last one is the cost approach. And the cost approach is the method you use if you're going to do a church, which has no income and doesn't have many comparable sales, or you're going to do a government building, or you're going to do a historic building. And when we decide we're going to do the cost approach, the first thing we have to decide is if we're going to do reproduction cost or replacement cost. Because what we're going to do in the cost approach is we are going to build an imaginary building in our head. And we have to decide whether that imaginary building is going to be an exact duplicate of our original building, or if it's going to be a building that has a similar utility and it's built with current materials and building techniques. So my favorite story about the cost approach is my church in New Brunswick in the 1970s was firebombed by the Puerto Rican separatist movement, the FALN, and it burned down. The church had been built in 1812. So when we went to collect our insurance premium, we wanted to have reproduction costs. We wanted to have an exact duplicate because we had beautiful stained glass windows from Germany. We had hand-hewn beams, but this was extraordinarily expensive. The bank didn't want to give us reproduction costs. I'm sorry, the insurance company didn't want to give us reproduction costs. They wanted to give us replacement costs. They wanted to build a building that was all made out of metal and had Anderson windows, not stained glass windows. They wanted to give us replacement costs. And we actually had a lawsuit that went on 25 years over this. And in the end, we kind of compromised. But when you're doing the cost approach, in your brain, when you're going to build the imaginary building that you're going to use to do this method, is it going to be reproduction or replacement? And normally, it's going to be replacement. The cost to produce a similar utility structure with current materials and current building techniques. Now, the next thing we have to do after we decide which one of these imaginary buildings we're going to build is our imaginary building is perfect, but our building that we're appraising is not perfect. It might be deeply into its cycle of change where its lifespan is almost over. It might have things that are wrong with it. So after we decide replacement or reproduction, and again, usually it's going to be replacement, we have to do what's called accrued depreciation. This is not tax depreciation. This is loss in value from all sources. Because remember, our imaginary building is going to be perfect. But our building that we're trying to find the value on is going to be less than perfect for many reasons. So in the cost approach, again, we best use it for churches, government buildings, and unique buildings. We have to apply accrued depreciation after we decide replacement or reproduction. And there's three sources of accrued depreciation. One is physical deterioration, wear and tear, or how far along it is in the life cycle. This might be expressed as a need for a new roof. This might be expressed in the building is halfway through its life cycle. Therefore, the improvement is only worth half of what it was to build it. Could be either way. So physical deterioration is the first source of accrued depreciation, and that's accrued, A-C-C-R-U-E-D, accrued depreciation, and that's wear and tear or how far along it is in its life cycle. The second source of accrued depreciation is functional obsolescence. That's how outdated or outmoded your original building was, because again, your imaginary building is perfect. So in the case of my church, you had to walk up a big set of stairs to get in. There was no handicapped entrance. There was only one bathroom in the church. That's all outdated or outmoded. And one of the things to remember about functional obsolescence is it can be corrected. We could have put a ramp or an elevator in, and actually we did put an elevator in. And we could have put in more bathrooms, and actually we did put in more bathrooms. So in your accrued depreciation, the first thing is physical deterioration, the next one is wear and tear, and the last one is functional obsolescence. The last source is external obsolescence, and that's loss of value from an outside source. So for instance, in our church in New Brunswick, at one point, the city of New Brunswick had constructed a parking deck next to the church. And that meant you could park when you went to church. Excuse me. For some reason, New Brunswick has taken down the parking deck and they're going to build some more high-rise condos there. So now the church has no parking. Well, that's an example of external obsolescence. That reduces the value of the church because there's no parking. People can't park anywhere near the church if they're going to come to the church. So again, in the cost approach, we're going to decide replacement or reproduction. Usually it's going to be replacement. We're going to subtract accrued depreciation, and that's physical deterioration, functional obsolescence, and external obsolescence. Now, a quick question is, we have these three things. And if you're getting your building appraised and the value doesn't come in where you want it because it has a lot of some of these things, which one of these three things can you change, or which ones of these three things can you change, and which one or two can you not change? So which ones can you not correct if you own the building? Well, of course, we can correct physical deterioration. We can do the repairs on the building that are needed. And of course, we can correct functional obsolescence. We can put in a bathroom and we can put in an elevator. We can't do anything about the loss of the parking deck because we don't own the parking deck. We don't own the property. So we can correct physical and we can correct functional obsolescence, but we can't correct external obsolescence. That is many times a question on the test. Now the question becomes, remember replacement or reproduction, and now we have to calculate how much our nice imaginary building is going to cost us. How much is that building going to cost us? And we have to find the value of that building. So again, in the cost approach, first we're going to find the value of the improvement. We're going to subtract accrued depreciation. We're going to add in the value of the land. That's the last step because land doesn't depreciate. But we still have that question of what's our imaginary building going to cost us to build? We still have the question of find the value of the improvement. What's the imaginary building we're building in our mind going to cost us to build? Well, there's a methodology to that. And the methodology to that is how do we find the cost to replace the structure? First one is the quantity survey method. This is known as the stick-by-stick, brick-by-brick method or the contractor's method. In this method, you add up every single element of construction. How many 2x4s you're going to have, how many windows you're going to have, how many toilets are you going to have, how many roof shingles are you going to have. This is called the stick-by-stick method or the contractor's method. The next method is called the unit in place method. You ask somebody how much it's going to cost to do the foundation. Then you ask them how much for the framing, and how much for the rough plumbing, and how much for the rough electrical, how much for the roofing, and how much for the finishing. And you add all those together, and that's the unit in place method. The next method is the square foot method. We know it costs $170 a square foot to build a building that's not of high trim. So if the building is 3,000 square foot, we multiply 3,000 times $170, and we get how much it's going to cost. The next method is the index method. If we know that that building cost us $1 million to build last year, and now prices are up 10%, then it's going to be $1,100,000 this year. Now remember, appraisals are subjective. So who decides which one of these methods you're going to use? Well, the appraiser might. But when I had a building burned down, and I told you about that last night, when the building being burned down terminated the leases, I had a appraiser come in and do a quantity survey method. That method of appraisal, using this method to find out the value of the imaginary structure that we were going to use for our appraisal, cost $7,000. The insurance company that I had wanted to use the comparable sales method, what a similar building cost last year per square foot. And those were very big differences in the value of my building that burned down in South Amboy. So again, we ended up going to court over that to find out whose value we were going to use. And in the long run, we compromised. More than they were offering, less than I wanted. All right? So again, that's how we find the value of our imaginary building. Then we subtract the accrued depreciation of our real building. And the accrued depreciation is wear and tear, functional obsolescence, and external obsolescence. And that brings us to who can do appraisals. You have to be a licensed appraiser to do an appraisal. As a real estate agent, we can do a broker's price opinion or a comparable market analysis. But when we do those, because of a court case that's RE/MAX versus Circuit Court in Richmond, Virginia, we have to put down, this is not an appraisal. Appraisals can only be done by a licensed appraiser. And many times agents don't bother to put that in. But if somebody were to rely on your appraisal as if it was an appraisal and you didn't put that in, you'd be in violation. So again, we are supposed to state that we're not doing an appraisal because only a licensed appraiser can do an appraisal. So that brings us to some simple questions. How would we value this home? This is a home in a development. We would use the comparable sales method. We would look at other homes that were similar to this one. How would we appraise a church? And this church is in Aberdeen. We would appraise this by the cost approach. So we would be pretty easy for us to determine reproduction or replacement because it's a modern building. So we would absolutely use replacement. And it's pretty easy for us to see how much accrued depreciation there is because there's no wear and tear and there's no functional obsolescence because it was just built. And if we look at around it, we can see there's probably no external obsolescence. And then we can also find the value of the land and add the value of the land back in. So we appraise a church by the cost approach. We appraise a single family house or a condo or a co-op or a multifamily house, if there's a lot of them, by the comparable sales method. And how do we appraise an apartment? Well, we appraise an apartment by the value by income. Now, if you've ever driven by an apartment complex and you see a sign outside that says first month's rent free, why do they do that? Well, that means they're having trouble renting their apartments. But if they were to lower the rents on all of the apartments, it would reduce the net operating income, and therefore the value of the apartment complex would be reduced. So instead of doing that, you give a rent free, and that maintains your full rental rolls so that your NOI is at the highest possible value. Now, there is another method that you can use for coming up with the value of income producing properties. And that other method is called the gross rent multiplier. And that's where you take the gross rent, all the rent you collect during a year, and you multiply it by a factor. And every different type of building in every location has a different factor. It might be 12 if it's an apartment building by Rutgers University's 6th Ward, within walking distance to College Ave. It might be 11 if it's in the 5th Ward in New Brunswick. It might be 8 if it's on Remsen Avenue where you buy drugs. All of those things, they have different gross rent multipliers. But the problem with gross rent multipliers is they do not take into account extraordinary expenses. So if this apartment complex, and this is in South River, supplied the heat to the apartments and the landlord paid for the heat, because perhaps they only have one big boiler per building, then the gross rent multiplier would not be as accurate as if you were applying it to a building where the tenants paid their own heat. And again, I have a really cool example in a minute to show you how this worked in real life. So the gross rent multiplier is a rule of thumb, which means it's kind of accurate, but it's not as accurate as value by income. Value by income is the net operating income divided by the cap rate. All right, again, this is another appraisal, same one on 5BB. Actually, it's this exact same document, I just placed it twice. And here's a really interesting test case that I ran across a couple of years ago. And I always wanted to put this into the presentation. And you can see I went by there today and took a picture of it. So I've been teaching this class for 20 years. And I've been telling the same joke for 20 years. So bear with me. If you look at this over here to the left, this is New Life books and religious reading materials. I'll tell you why this is important in a minute. And on the other side over here is shoe repair. And so my joke is, this is a religious book and religious article business, and this is a shoe repair business. My joke is, in this building, no matter what, you can get your soul saved. Okay, that's the joke. Same joke for 20 years. Now, by the way, if you're superstitious and you're a real estate agent, you can buy in this building here St. Joseph statues. And the superstition is, if you bury a St. Joseph statue upside down in somebody's yard, St. Joseph helps you sell it. So again, that's where you buy St. Joseph statues. So we have a question. I just want to make sure I understand. When finding the adjusted sales price of a home, you look at superior and inferior comparables. Is that correct? When finding the adjusted sales price of a home. So when you are finding the adjusted sales price of a home as a shopper, you're not using this stuff at all. This is when you're trying to appraise your subject property. You're going to make adjustments for superior and inferior amenities or condition of or size of the comparables. Okay, so I don't quite know how to directly answer that question, but on an appraisal, you are adjusting the comparables to make them similar to the subject. This is not about determining what you're going to pay by making adjustments to a property for condition and stuff. That's an inspection and a business decision. This is the calculations and the manner and method by which you come up with your opinion of value of the subject property. You could do this type of a analysis on a property you're trying to buy. If you were trying to figure out what was the value of a property and you were going to buy a 5BB place, you could pull the comparables and you could construct a chart like this and make all the adjustments based on the chart. Okay. But again, this is to come up with a value of 5BB by making the comparables similar to 5BB, by adjusting the comparables, and then looking at what their values were, because these values down here kind of indicate what the value of 5BB should be, because we've adjusted the comparables to make them more similar to 5BB. And again, this is a tough thing to comprehend, and I understand that. But,
Hey, Bruce.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So, can we use like the adjustables to, how do I say this? Square footage. So if we times the square footage,
Oh yeah, so if you're asking the question, if you're looking at a house to purchase and it's 2,100 square feet, and
yeah.
a house sold down the street that was 2,300 square feet,
yes,
you could take the price that it sold for divided by the square feet, and
yes,
dollars per square foot. And as you can see, if you look closely at the appraisal here, I actually have a calculation for all those. Here's the dollar per square foot that all these houses sold for. Here's the dollar per square foot.
Okay.
But that's only one factor of many. And look at the difference here. We have a $252 a square foot versus $180 a square foot here. And that's because this property sold for a lot of money. And this doesn't take into consideration the adjustments, right? These numbers are all above the adjustments. So if we took these numbers,
how do we take the adjustment? Like, I'm trying to figure out how to make the adjustment more, I guess, comprehensible, so that I can understand how to come to that number.
Okay, I'll try to show you something. It might take me a minute to get to that, but I'll try to show you something. I was advised by somebody that I shouldn't include that particular slide in my presentation, but I'll see if I can find it for you.
Thank you.
And if I can't find it here, I'll send it to you tomorrow via email. I'll send it to everybody tomorrow via email.
Thank you.
Just don't say you got it from me, because I understand this guy who passes this out, he sues you if you use it in your presentation.
Okay.
So here's a test case. This is the place you can save your soul. You can save the soul on your shoe, or you can save your mortal soul by going into either one of those doors. This particular building, some gentlemen had owned this for 30 years and they were looking to sell it. Okay, so the two stores paid $1,000 a month rent apiece. There was 4 apartments. They paid $800 a month apiece. Okay, you know, 1-bedroom apartments, $800 a month apiece. They were asking for me to get them a price on this building and sell it. So we know that the value by income is equal to NOI divided by the cap rate. And so we're going to assume a cap rate of 7%. We know the taxes were $9,300. We know the electric was $2,400. We know the insurance was $2,000. And this building, this was not a bit of good building to use the gross rent multiplier on, because this had one gigantic oil boiler in the basement that fired all of these buildings, and it was $9,000 a year for oil. One of the reasons it was $9,000 a year for oil is in the religious artifacts building, one thermostat for the whole building. And the person who was in this building, her name is Joan, was an old lady. And what do old ladies do with thermostats? They turn them all the way up. So I would drive by this building in the winter, and all these guys would have their windows open up here because she had the thermostat cranked up so high. So that's one of the reasons the oil bill was so high. So I was having trouble selling this building because everybody thought the price was too high. So if you use the numbers I have here, rent of $62,400, that's 8,888, that's 32, 42, 52 times 12 is 62,400. That's the rent. I'm not including vacancy. We're just not going to count that in tonight. But I'm going to subtract my expenses here and my cap rate. So I'm going to get an income of $62,400. I'm going to get expenses of $22,700. Now you notice no mortgage payments because we do not use debt service. No mortgage payments. Remember, $62,400 rent. So $62,400 minus $22,700 gives us an NOI of $39,700. That's our NOI, $39,700. $39,700 divided by our cap rate. That's our formula for value by income. And that gives us an income of $567,142. That's what our income was. Now these guys were asking $600,000 for the building. Why? Because $600,000 was a nice round number. However, people were not willing to pay that. So I was driving home from class, and again, you know, this is what I do for fun. I was driving home for class one night, and it was in the winter, and I had an office in South Amboy. And so as I'm driving home from class in the winter, I noticed, and it was a cold night, all these guys have their windows open. And the idea struck me, if I want to sell this building, we got to do something about the utility bills, that $9,000 a year in oil. We got to do something about that. So here's what I did. And let me get this off here so I don't get stuck with it forever. Here's our value now, $567,142. How can I make the building worth more money? And I made the building worth more money by reducing the rents. But at the same time, I also removed the oil heat. Now, if we go back to here, these guys were getting their heat for free. They were getting their heat for free and paying $800. And these guys were getting their heat for free and paying $1,000. So I went to every tenant and I said, here's the deal, guys. We got to get rid of this big oil in the basement. And up here, they all said, well, thank God, because Joan keeps the heat way too high. And also, these things had no air conditioning units. So in the summer, they were very hot. So what I did was I went to an HVAC guy. And I said, let's remove the oil heat. and instead, let's add heat pumps. Now, heat pumps are those things you see in like motels, where they're the unit that heats or air conditions, depending on where you click the adjustment, the knobs to. They're not extraordinarily efficient in real hot or real cold weather, but they could certainly do for a store, and they could certainly do for one-bedroom apartments where they're all sitting on top of each other. And I went and I got estimates to put in a unit of a heat pump in each one of the units. So we have 6 units times $5,000 per unit. It was going to cost me $30,000 to put in all the heat pumps and remove the oil heat and the big oil tank in the basement. But now, each of these guys would be paying their own heat. It would all go on their electric bill. So how would they be satisfied with doing that? That's why we reduced their rent by $50 a month, because otherwise they wouldn't go for it, because why should they pay now $800 a month and no longer get their heat for free? Now they pay $750 a month and their heat would be supplied by the heat pump. And maybe $50 wasn't enough to heat their thing in the winter per month, but at least now they had central air conditioning. So the trade-off, everybody signed off on it and agreed to it. So again, we reduced the rents on each unit by $50 a month. We removed the oil heat, and we got an estimate to put in heat pumps at $5,000 per unit times 6 and remove the oil for $30,000. And what that gave us now was a new income. Our income, right, because it was $50 a month less on each of those, our new income is $58,800. And our new expenses is $13,700 because we took away that $9,000 for oil. That gave us an NOI of $45,100. So if we take $45,100 and we divide it by 0.07, now our value is closer to what these guys were asking for. They were asking for $600, and now it's worth $644 because we removed that extraordinary expense and recaptured the cost of it. So our gain was $77,143 from the original value. We take away the $30,000 that it would cost us to do that, and that would end up giving us an increase in value of $47,143. So I got all this documentation together. I got the tenants signing off on the on the decrease in rent. If we did this, I got the contractor to sign a bid so that in the event we move forward, he would do that work for $30,000. And then I started marketing the property as it had a true 7% cap rate, which gave us a value. Again, our value, remember, is going to be more money now. Our value is going to be $644,000, and we're only selling it for $600,000, so it appears to be a value. And then we got the property sold. Okay. Now I want to tell you what happened here. In real life, we ended up selling the property for $644,000. This is how we negotiated it. We ended up selling the property for $644,000. We gave the seller a credit. We gave the buyer a credit for $30,000. So that buyer got a credit for $30,000. So he only paid $614,000 for it, but he had $30,000. He paid $644,000, but he got a $30,000 credit, and he ended up only paying $614,000 for the building, which was more than we were getting offered before. And when he bought the building, he never made the changes. He just kept the $30,000 in his pocket. So his building is still only worth what it was worth originally. His building is still only worth what it was worth originally, but in concept, we had made it worth more by making all these arrangements. His building was still only worth now what it is here because he still got this $9,000 a year in oil. So it's still only worth $567,000, but he's got $30,000 in his pocket. So again, it was one of those things where we ended up getting the building sold by just a little bit of imagination. And I've got to tell you, I'm not that smart, but because I was teaching the class on appraisals that night, and because I was driving home and I noticed the windows open, I said, wait, I got an idea how we can fix this. So keep that in mind when you're trying to increase or decrease the value of a building. There's things you can do. Increasing the rent always increases the value. Decreasing the expenses always increases the value. All right, so now let's go over a couple of questions. Which of the following would not be considered part of the cost approach? Remember, the cost approach is the value of the imaginary building minus accrued depreciation, then adding back in the value of the land. So it says which is not. So depreciation is, because we have accrued depreciation. We have to decide whether we want reproduction or replacement. So reproduction is. Land value is the last step. We have to add back in the land value. So in the cost approach, we do not use rent loss. We do use rent loss in the value by income, but we do not use rent loss in the cost approach. We do use it in the value of income, value by income, but not in the cost approach. Question number 2, the 3 variables in the formula used in the income approach. And again, it's value by income is equal to NOI divided by cap rate. So income, rate, and value. That's the formula. We don't use rate, value, and expenses. We don't use gross rent multiplier. That's not value by income. We don't use value, income, and expenses because that doesn't have the cap rate in it. So our answer is income, rate, and value for number 2. Number 3, the 2 characteristics of real estate that govern the way the market responds to supply and demand. And this is a tough question. The answer they give in the book is uniqueness and immobility, because you can't move them. And whatever the supply is what it is. Real estate is not what they call fungible. Money is fungible. Money can move anywhere. Real estate is not fungible. This is a kind of a technical question. Number 4, when the supply of a commodity decreases, when you have less houses on the market than you had last month, when the supply decreases, prices tend to rise. So right now we're seeing rise in prices because the supply is decreasing. Why is the supply decreasing? One of the reasons is they stopped foreclosures since March. No foreclosures since March. Another reason is people aren't putting their homes on the market right now because they're afraid to let people in because of Corona. So there's very few houses on the market, so prices are tending to rise. Question number 5, the income approach to value would be most important in the appraisal of, so not a condominium, that's comparable sales, not a single family residence, that's comparable sales. So we're looking at the income. So an office building would be most appropriate for income because it has income, and a vacant residential lot, that doesn't have any income. So we wouldn't use the income approach. So again, the income approach to value, the income approach is most important in an office building or in a factory or in an apartment building. Okay, so a long and complicated chapter. We're going to do it again. This won't be the only time we do it. Maybe the chart is on here. Here it is. So you guys didn't see this here, but this is the chart that tells you what kind of adjustments to make in the $250,000 range. Here's some examples of external obsolescence. If you're on a busy road in a $250,000 price range, you're going to subtract $7,000. So actually the adjustment is $7,000, but if you're on a busy road, that's a negative. So you're going to increase for inferior. So if the comparable is on a busy road, you would add $7,000, right? You should never make adjustments to the subject. So if you're on a busy road, you would add $7,000 in the appraisal because you're increasing for inferior. Another example of external obsolescence is power lines. On a $250,000 house, to your comparables, you would add $3,000. Now, if you're just looking at a house on its own and you're not doing an appraisal and it has power lines nearby, you would subtract $3,000. If you're just looking at a house on its own and it's on a busy road, you would subtract $7,000. Okay, so I'll send these charts to you tomorrow so that you can kind of get an idea of what the different adjustments might be, and in all different price ranges. You can see, the adjustments are different in each price range. And this will certainly help you a little bit. I want to show you something I consider a little funny. Is this guy who I've been going to for 15 years? It's the Otto Group. He predicted prices were going to really come down quickly because of Corona, and he was wrong. He predicted in the best case it would only come down a little. He was wrong. So far, prices are going up. He didn't predict prices would be up until 2022. So, I've been going to him for 15 years. This is the second time that he's been major league wrong in terms of his predictions. But nobody has a crystal ball. So he's been major league wrong in terms of his prediction. But again, nobody has a crystal ball. Okay, I think that's the last slide. Yep, that's it for tonight. I hope you guys got some of it. I will record this and put it up tomorrow so you can watch it again. And I may have another short class over the weekend, trying to get people all licensed as quickly as we can while the market's still really, really kicking butt. And we'll get you some more stuff over for you to have for study guides.
So Bruce, it's going to be on Saturday or Sunday, or approximate when?
And you want to vote real quick? Vote, and I'll do it on one of those. It would probably be about this time when it gets dark out, so 7:30 again. So anybody care whether it's Saturday or Sunday?
I would rather do it on Sunday instead of Saturday.
So we'll do it on Sunday. That's easy.
Okay.
We'll do it on Sunday.
Thank you.
After 60 minutes. I always watch 60 minutes on Sundays.
Okay.
All right. So
Okay.
that's enough for tonight. Thank you guys, and we'll see you. We'll see you on Sunday night, and then again on Tuesday. And I'll send this chart to everybody tomorrow.
Thank you,
night.
Bruce.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you for the gift. Today is my birthday.
You're welcome. Done?